This time I'm going to talk about the basics, about when somebody's new to the hobby coming in. Since OSR is all about getting new blood, enjoying the old games. So as a player, let's start as a player. As a player, what you need is two things: pencil, paper. Easy enough. Don't worry about character sheets. Don't worry about the rules. Your DM will have the rules. You may want to get them, later on, but right now you don't have to. Capiche? As a DM, it gets a little harder. I'm looking at my books. Yes. What you have to have is the rule book. And you've got to read the rule book beforehand. And I'm not saying you have to quote chapter and verse either. But you got to kind of know basically how the game works, how character creation works, how combat works especially, and other things like that. A good rule book will walk you through this. You also need notes, adventure notes, or a module. If you have bought a module, you should read through that too. Players, no, you don't read through modules. But DMs, GMs, you're supposed to be reading through the module to see how it works, how it sets up, what the monsters are, what the situations are. It's like, homework. You got to have homework. Sorry to say. Also, maps. Now, to play, I usually use a battle map or the Blue Dungeon Tiles by Red Kobold Games. Yeah, it's a plug. And as far as markers go, everybody has to have a marker, their character. You can do miniatures, paint miniatures, and do miniatures. There's a whole big sub-hobby of painting miniatures in the hobby. And you can do that. I use tokens. I make tokens from things like pictures off the internet or Magic the Gathering cards. Real good source for tokens. I punch them out, put them on 1-inch washers. I'll show you that in another video. And you have to have markers and like I said, a map that usually you want to use a grid map. Sometimes depends on the game, you might want to use a hex map if you like superheroes, that kind of thing. And what else do you need? Oh, of course, stats. Things like monster stats, NPC stats, that's non-player character stats. Basically, and it's real simple too. If you're using, most games are simple. Champions, but things like D&D, it's, what's the monster's armor class? What's the monster's hit points? What damage do they do? How many hit dice, which means you roll a d8 per hit die. If it says like the monster has 3 hit dice, so you roll 3d8 and that's his hit points. And that's all you had to do. And I just jot a few notes down. I have a form. I have a page that I came up with just to list monster stats, boom, 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 boom. So they're right there for me. Also, a DM screen is handy. Some people like to do it with, rolling out. I like to do it behind the screen. Nothing wrong with that. Besides, the screen has all the tables that you can reference. So that's a good thing too. You also need sometimes tables. Now, what I'm talking about is things like encounter tables. When your players go out into the wilderness or in a dungeon, what you have to do is, or you should do every turn, roll a d6. And on a 1, there's an encounter. Now, it doesn't have to be a monster. It doesn't have to be something you fight, but there's an encounter. It could be just like, some people you pass on the road, hey, how you doing? Somebody walking into the camp asking directions or something like that. But the encounter tables are usually for like monsters. There's really good ones back in the back of like the D&D books, monster manuals, things like that, where they will give you charts anywhere from D4 to D20. And you can also make your own, depending on what the terrain is, what kind of, what area they're in. Also, that applies to dungeons too. You roll in those because they also have, depending on the level of the dungeon, what type of monster you got. And those are very handy. There's also tables for other things you can roll up to, like taverns and things like that, if you don't have them planned already in your notes, which you should. Okay. And also, I want to talk about what they call, if you're playing a dungeon, and this applies to wilderness areas too. If you're playing in a dungeon, what they're called stocking the dungeon. What you do is you go through your dungeon and find out what it's all about. What is the dungeon all about? Who lived there? Find some kind of backstory. This gets kind of a little esoteric, but as far as stocking goes, it gives you an idea of who was there and who's there now, as far as like what kind of monsters are there, what kind of treasures there, what kind of tricks, traps, anything dangerous there that the player characters might run across. So that's part of the DM's job. That's where the magic happens. The other part of the magic happens when you're at the table with the players and you all make magic. I'm sounded kind of weird anyway. But anyway, that's pretty much the basics of as far as like what you need to play. So we'll talk about more stuff later and maybe elaborate on a few other things that I mentioned here next time. So take care, and I'll hope to see you around.